For decades, Canada was one of the safest and most dependable customers American businesses could have. The two countries shared the longest international border in the world. Their factories were connected. Their tourists crossed back and forth. Canadian shoppers filled their carts with American food, clothing, wine, and household products without thinking twice. That relationship created hundreds of billions of dollars in trade every year. But something has changed. Across Canada, consumers are looking more closely at product labels. They are searching for the red maple leaf. They are choosing Canadian brands and avoiding products made in the United States. Some are also canceling vacations to Florida, California, New York, and other American destinations. This is not simply an angry reaction on social media. It is beginning to appear in real economic data. And for American companies, the most dangerous part may not be the immediate loss of sales. The real danger is that Canadian consumers are developing new habits. Once a shopper discovers another brand, another vacation destination, or another supplier, there is no guarantee that the old customer will ever return. One of the clearest examples can be found in the American wine industry. Before the trade conflict intensified, Canada was the largest foreign market for American wine. In 2024, shipments to Canada were worth nearly $460 million. The country accounted for more than 1/3 of all American wine exports. For wineries in California, especially smaller family businesses, Canada was not just another market. It was a major source of income that had taken decades to build. Then the political relationship deteriorated. In March 2025, several Canadian provinces removed American alcoholic beverages from government-controlled stores. Wine from California and other American regions disappeared from shelves that had carried those products for years. The effect was dramatic. During 2025, American wine exports to Canada fell by approximately 78%. The Wine Institute estimated that producers lost more than $357 million in export value. That loss cannot easily be replaced. A large corporation may be able to redirect its products to another country. A small winery cannot suddenly create thousands of new customers overseas. It may already be dealing with high production costs, falling domestic consumption, expensive loans, and too much unsold inventory. When its largest foreign customer disappears, the damage moves quickly through the business. Orders are canceled. Storage facilities fill up. Distributors reduce purchases. Workers lose hours. Expansion plans are delayed. In the worst cases, businesses are pushed closer to bankruptcy. Wine is only one part of the story. The Buy Canadian movement has also changed how people shop for food. Research published by the Bank of Canada found that as trade tensions increased in March 2025, the share of food spending going toward Canadian products rose by about 2 percentage points. Spending on products from the United States declined by a similar amount. That may sound like a small change, but in a national grocery market, even a modest shift can represent hundreds of millions of dollars moving from one group of suppliers to another. More importantly, the change did not disappear after a few weeks. It continued through the summer. Consumers were not simply expressing anger in an opinion poll. They were changing what they placed in their shopping carts. The boycott is not absolute. Price still matters. Many Canadian families are dealing with their own cost of living pressures, and they will not always pay much more for a domestic product. But when a Canadian alternative is available at a similar price, more shoppers are now willing to choose it. That decision can become automatic. Imagine a family in Ontario that has purchased the same American breakfast cereal for years. After the trade dispute begins, the parents decide to try a Canadian brand instead. At first, the decision may be political, but after several months, the family becomes familiar with the new product. The children accept it. The parents know where to find it. The price is reasonable. Eventually, the decision is no longer political at all. It has become a habit. Even if the trade conflict ends, that family may have no reason to return to the American brand. This is what businesses fear when economists talk about demand destruction. A tariff can be removed, a government restriction can be reversed, a border crossing can reopen, but a lost customer is much harder to recover. The same behavioral change is visible in travel. For years, Canadians were among the most important international visitors to the United States. They drove across the border for shopping trips, sporting events, vacations, and visits with family. American communities near the border depended heavily on that traffic. So did warm weather destinations such as Florida and Arizona. But beginning in early 2025, Canadian travel to the United States fell sharply. Statistics Canada reported that Canadian residents made 21.6% fewer trips involving visits to the United States during the second quarter of 2025 compared with the same period 1 year earlier. Their spending in the United States also fell. Instead of traveling south, some Canadians stayed home. Others chose Mexico, Europe, the Caribbean, or different overseas destinations. For an American hotel, restaurant, gas station, or retail store, the reason does not change the financial result. A customer who does not arrive does not spend money. The boycott has therefore become more than a dispute over a few bottles of wine or products on a supermarket shelf. It is influencing where people shop, where they travel, and whom they trust. A Pew Research Center survey published in July 2026 found that Canadians and Mexicans now view China more positively than the United States. That does not mean China has replaced the United States as the dominant economic partner in North America. Trade relationships of this size do not disappear overnight. Canada and Mexico remain deeply connected to the American economy. But public opinion can shape economic behavior. When trust declines, consumers become more willing to search for alternatives. That creates an opening for domestic producers, European suppliers, Asian manufacturers, and Chinese companies. The question is no longer whether the boycott has caused damage. The data shows that it has. The much more important question is whether the United States is losing something that cannot be quickly restored. It may be losing the loyalty of its closest customers. To understand why this matters so much, it is necessary to look beyond the word boycott. A boycott sounds temporary, it sounds emotional. It suggests that consumers will become angry, avoid a product for a few weeks, and then return to their old habits once the political argument fades. But the current conflict between the United States and Canada is affecting something deeper. It is changing the way Canadians think about economic dependence. For many years, the relationship appeared almost automatic. American products entered Canadian stores. Canadian energy, minerals, food, and industrial components moved south. Factories on both sides of the border operated as parts of the same system. That system was built on trust and predictability. Companies invested money because they believed the rules would remain relatively stable. A manufacturer in Ontario could sell components to a factory in Michigan. A winery in California could develop a long-term relationship with a Canadian distributor. A family in Quebec could plan a vacation in Florida without considering politics. Trade was not simply about prices. It was based on the assumption that the relationship would continue. Tariffs damaged that assumption. When the United States threatened or imposed new costs on Canadian goods, the political message became almost as important as the economic effect. Many Canadians did not see the tariffs as a normal disagreement between trading partners. They saw them as pressure from a much larger country against one of its closest allies. That perception gave the boycott emotional power. Buying Canadian became more than a shopping decision. For some consumers, it became a way to defend national independence. Stores responded quickly. Retailers placed maple leaf symbols beside domestic products. Grocery chains promoted Canadian alternatives. Mobile applications helped shoppers identify where products were made. Social media users shared lists of American brands and possible replacements. This made participation easy. A consumer did not need to attend a protest or join a political organization. The only action required was to choose a different product. That is one reason the movement spread so widely. It also explains why small American businesses may be more vulnerable than major corporations. Large companies have several advantages. They can reduce prices, they can change packaging, they can move products through different distributors, they can spend millions of dollars on advertising. They may also operate factories in Canada, allowing them to present some products as locally made. A small producer usually cannot do any of those things. Consider a family-owned food company in a northern American state. It may have spent years building a customer base in Canada. Its profit margin may already be narrow. Transportation, labor, packaging, insurance, and borrowing costs may all be rising. If Canadian orders suddenly fall, the owner cannot simply open a new market in Europe or Asia. Finding a foreign distributor takes time. Products may need new labels. Regulations can be different. Shipping costs are higher. Customers may not recognize the brand. Even when another market is available, replacing lost Canadian sales may take years. This creates a serious imbalance. Political leaders can announce tariffs in a few minutes. Businesses may need years to repair the consequences. The burden also moves through supply chains. A decline in wine exports does not affect only wineries. It affects bottle manufacturers, label printers, trucking companies, storage facilities, farm workers, equipment suppliers, and local restaurants that depend on tourism. A decline in Canadian travel does not affect only airlines. It can reduce business for hotels, rental car companies, amusement parks, shopping centers, restaurants, gas stations, and small towns near the border. This is why headline trade figures can hide the real damage. The total value of trade between the United States and Canada remains enormous. Hundreds of billions of dollars continue to cross the border. That can make the relationship look healthy from a distance. But national totals do not show which communities are being hurt. A large increase in energy exports can hide a collapse in wine sales. Strong industrial trade can hide empty hotel rooms. A rising stock market can exist at the same time as a family business loses its largest customer. These are two different economic realities. Financial markets often focus on large companies. Investors watch corporate earnings, stock indexes, and major trade agreements. Small businesses live much closer to the consumer. They feel the moment when a Canadian shopper chooses another product. They feel the canceled order from a distributor. They feel the empty parking lot during a holiday weekend. They do not have the financial protection of a multinational corporation. That is also why claims that tariffs will automatically rebuild American manufacturing deserve closer examination. Tariffs can protect certain domestic industries. They can also encourage companies to move production closer to American consumers. But they also increase costs for manufacturers that depend on imported materials and components. North American production is highly integrated. An automobile assembled in the United States may contain parts from Canada and Mexico. Some components cross the border several times during the manufacturing process. A tariff applied at one stage can raise costs at every later stage. Copper, aluminum, steel, machinery, and electronic components all affect the final price of a vehicle. If those costs increase, the manufacturer has several choices. It can accept lower profits. It can raise prices. It can reduce production. It can delay investment, or it can cut jobs. None of those outcomes guarantees a manufacturing revival. The same problem appears in agriculture. American farmers often depend on a small number of major foreign buyers. When a trade conflict pushes those buyers toward competitors in Brazil, Argentina, Canada, or other countries, farmers can lose more than one season of sales. Foreign buyers build new relationships. They sign transportation agreements, they invest in storage facilities, they develop trust with other suppliers. Once those systems are established, American farmers may not recover the entire market even after the political dispute ends. This is the pattern now worrying American exporters. The immediate damage can be measured in lower sales. The long-term damage is the creation of alternatives. Canada is increasing interest in domestic products and other foreign suppliers. Mexico is attempting to protect its own industries while expanding trade relationships outside the United States. Companies around the world are learning that dependence on one market can create political risk. This does not mean the United States will suddenly lose its position as the largest economic power in North America. Its market is too large. Its financial system is too important. Its industries remain deeply connected to both Canada and Mexico. But economic influence is not permanent. It depends on trust. Every time a customer finds another supplier, that influence becomes slightly weaker. Every time a country builds a new trade route, it becomes less dependent on Washington. And every time an American business loses a customer it once considered permanent, the cost of repairing the relationship becomes higher. The most serious consequence may not be visible in a monthly trade report. It may be happening quietly inside the minds of consumers. For decades, American brands benefited from familiarity. People recognized the names, they trusted the packaging, they knew what to expect. That familiarity created an enormous advantage. A shopper usually does not compare every product in a store. Most people make decisions quickly. They buy what they have purchased before. That means brand loyalty is often less about deep affection and more about habit. But a boycott interrupts that habit. It forces consumers to stop and examine the label. It encourages them to compare prices. It gives competing brands a chance to enter the decision. Once that happens, American companies can no longer depend on automatic loyalty. A Canadian shopper may discover that a domestic product is just as good. Another may choose a European alternative. A restaurant may replace an American supplier with a Canadian one. A provincial buyer may sign a new contract with a company from another country. Each decision looks small. Together they can change an entire market. This is why the political damage is so difficult to reverse. A government can announce a new agreement and declare that the conflict is over. Officials can shake hands. Tariffs can be reduced or removed. But consumers do not receive a command telling them to return to their old products. They continue buying what now feels normal. Businesses understand this risk. Winning a customer for the first time is expensive. A company must advertise, build distribution, offer competitive prices, and convince the buyer to take a chance. Keeping an existing customer is usually much easier. When that customer leaves, the company must begin the process again. The problem becomes even greater when the customer believes the departure was connected to national dignity or economic security. In Canada, the Buy Canadian movement encouraged people to view ordinary spending as a form of economic defense. The message was simple. If the country could not control American trade policy, Canadian consumers could still control where they spent their money. That idea gave local companies an opportunity they might not otherwise have received. Some domestic brands gained shelf space. Farmers and food producers received greater attention. Retailers promoted local supply chains more aggressively. Even companies that could not replace American imports immediately began looking for ways to reduce future dependence. This is where a temporary boycott can produce permanent structural change. A retailer that once relied on one American supplier may now maintain contracts with several suppliers. A manufacturer may begin purchasing materials from Canada, Europe, or Asia. A provincial government may create new procurement rules that favor domestic products. A family may choose to vacation inside Canada instead of driving south. These changes make the system more resistant to future pressure from the United States. They also create opportunities for China. China does not need to replace the United States completely to benefit. It only needs to capture part of the market that American companies lose. Chinese manufacturers already compete aggressively on price. They produce electronics, machinery, household goods, vehicles, clothing, and countless consumer products. In Mexico, Chinese investment and imports have expanded rapidly in recent years. Chinese companies have shown strong interest in manufacturing, retail, transportation, and electric vehicles. But the picture is complicated. Mexico is not simply opening its doors to every Chinese product. Its government also wants to protect domestic industries and preserve access to the American market. That means Mexico may place tariffs or restrictions on Chinese imports while still accepting Chinese investment in selected sectors. For American companies, the important point is not that China will immediately dominate Mexico or Canada. The important point is that both countries now have more reasons to search for alternatives. China is one option, Europe is another, domestic production is another. Every additional option reduces American leverage. This matters because the United States has often treated access to its market as a source of power. Countries wanted American customers. Companies wanted access to American investment. Governments wanted stable relationships with Washington. That influence remains enormous. But power based on dependence works only while other countries believe they have no practical alternative. If Canada builds stronger domestic supply chains, it becomes harder to pressure. If Mexico expands trade with Asia and Europe, it becomes less vulnerable. If foreign consumers become comfortable without American products, threats of future tariffs may become less effective. The United States could then face an uncomfortable reality. Policies designed to increase American power may instead encourage other countries to reduce their exposure to America. This does not happen all at once. It happens through thousands of ordinary decisions. A grocery store changes suppliers. A consumer buys another brand. A tourist chooses another destination. A distributor signs a new contract. A factory purchases components from another country. Over time, these decisions create a parallel network of trade and consumer behavior that does not depend as heavily on the United States. The impact also returns to American workers. When exports fall, businesses usually try to protect themselves. They reduce inventory, they delay hiring, they cancel equipment purchases, they cut employee hours. If the problem continues, layoffs may follow. This is especially dangerous in small towns where one industry supports many other businesses. A winery does not operate alone. It purchases equipment, bottles, labels, fuel, insurance, maintenance, and transportation. Its employees spend money at local stores and restaurants. When the winery loses sales, the entire community feels the pressure. The same pattern appears in border towns that depend on Canadian visitors. A decline in tourism can affect hotels, stores, restaurants, and entertainment businesses at the same time. Political leaders may continue pointing to national employment figures or stock market gains, but those numbers do not erase the losses experienced by individual communities. An economy can look strong at the national level while specific groups are being damaged. That is why the argument about whether the American economy is booming can be misleading. The more important question is who is benefiting and who is paying the price. Large companies with global operations may adapt. Wealthy investors may continue making money. But a small exporter, a hotel near the border, or a family-owned farm has fewer ways to escape the consequences. For them, the boycott is not an abstract political debate. It is a missing order, an empty room, a reduced paycheck, or a customer who may never return. The final question is not whether the United States can survive a Canadian boycott. Of course it can. The American economy is far too large to collapse because consumers in one neighboring country decide to avoid certain products. The real question is whether American companies are being forced to pay for a political strategy they did not create and cannot control. Many of these businesses did nothing to damage the relationship with Canada. A winery in California did not write the tariff policy. A hotel owner in Maine did not threaten Canadian sovereignty. A farmer in the Midwest did not decide how Washington would negotiate with its closest trading partners. Yet these are the people who can lose customers, revenue, and jobs. That is what makes the situation so important. Trade policy is often discussed as if countries are moving pieces on a board. One side raises a tariff, the other side responds. Negotiators meet, markets react. But every number in a trade report represents real decisions made by businesses and families. A decline in exports can mean a warehouse filled with products that cannot be sold. A decline in tourism can mean fewer shifts for hotel workers. A decline in restaurant traffic can mean a small business owner delaying rent or reducing staff. The economic pain rarely stays inside the industry that first receives the shock. It spreads. That does not mean tariffs are always ineffective or unjustified. Governments sometimes use them to protect strategic industries, respond to unfair trade practices, or reduce dependence on foreign competitors. The problem begins when tariffs are treated as a simple weapon with no cost to the country using them. Import taxes are paid inside the importing economy. Businesses may pay more for materials. Consumers may face higher prices. Exporters may be targeted by retaliation. And competitors are given an opportunity to take market share. This is especially dangerous when the conflict involves Canada and Mexico. These are not distant economies with limited connections to the United States. They are deeply integrated into American production, transportation, agriculture, energy, tourism, and retail. The three countries do not simply trade finished products. They help build many products together. A component may be designed in one country, manufactured in another, and assembled in the third. When political conflict disrupts that system, there is no clean dividing line between foreign damage and domestic damage. Costs move across the border and return in another form. An American tariff can hurt a Canadian supplier. The higher cost can then hurt an American factory that depends on that supplier. If the factory raises prices, the American consumer pays more. If the factory reduces production, the American worker may lose hours or employment. That is why the language of winning and losing can be misleading. In a deeply connected economy, both sides can lose at the same time. Canada also faces serious risks. Canadian businesses depend heavily on access to the American market. Many communities cannot easily replace American customers. A prolonged trade conflict could reduce investment, weaken exports, and raise costs for Canadian families. Mexico faces similar pressure. Its manufacturing sector is closely tied to the United States. Millions of jobs depend on North American trade. None of these countries can separate from one another without major disruption. But dependence does not guarantee loyalty. In fact, political pressure can convince a country that dependence itself is the danger. That appears to be one of the most important lessons emerging from Canada. The boycott has encouraged consumers and businesses to ask a question that received far less attention before the conflict. Why are we so dependent on American products? Once that question is asked, the search for alternatives begins. Some alternatives may be more expensive. Some may be lower quality. Some may come from countries that create different economic or political risks. But over time, domestic producers improve. New suppliers compete. Distribution networks expand. The alternative becomes easier to use. That process does not require Canada to stop trading with the United States. It only requires Canada to become slightly less dependent on American goods each year. For American businesses, even a small, permanent loss of market share can be significant. The strongest warning comes from the wine industry. Canada was once the most important foreign customer for American wine. That position was built through years of marketing, distribution, personal relationships, and consumer trust. Then, in a very short period, access to that market was sharply reduced. American producers can hope that their bottles eventually return to Canadian shelves. But returning to the shelf is not the same as returning to the shopping cart. During the absence, Canadian consumers may discover local wines from British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. Retailers may strengthen relationships with producers from Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, or South Africa. Restaurants may redesign their wine lists. Distributors may invest in other brands. When American products return, they may enter a market that has already moved on. This is the difference between temporary lost sales and permanent lost demand. Temporary sales can return when conditions improve. Destroyed demand must be rebuilt from the beginning. The same risk exists in tourism. A Canadian family that once visited Florida every winter may choose Mexico or the Caribbean instead. After discovering a new destination, that family may continue returning there for years. A couple that once crossed the border for shopping may begin spending that money closer to home. A business traveler may become comfortable using virtual meetings or different regional partners. Every canceled trip creates the possibility of a new habit. This is why trust is one of the most valuable assets in international trade. Trust reduces uncertainty. It gives companies the confidence to invest. It allows consumers to buy without worrying that politics will suddenly interrupt supply. Once trust is damaged, every future decision becomes more cautious. Businesses diversify. Governments create backup plans. Consumers look for alternatives. The United States still has enormous advantages. It has a huge consumer market, advanced industries, major financial institutions, strong universities, valuable natural resources, and some of the most recognized companies in the world. Canada and Mexico cannot simply replace the United States. But the United States can still weaken its own advantages by making economic relationships feel unstable. A powerful country does not maintain influence only by showing that it can apply pressure. It also maintains influence by convincing partners that the relationship is valuable, predictable, and worth protecting. When partners begin planning for life without that relationship, influence starts to decline. The Canadian boycott may eventually lose some of its political intensity. News cycles will change, governments will change, new agreements may be signed. Some consumers will return to American brands, some tourists will return to American destinations. Trade will continue because geography and economic reality make cooperation necessary. But the relationship may not return to exactly what it was before. Too many consumers have examined the label. Too many businesses have searched for new suppliers. Too many families have considered different destinations. And too many people have discovered that they have choices. That may be the most lasting consequence of this conflict. The boycott did not need to destroy American trade to succeed. It only needed to break the assumption that Canadian customers would always remain loyal. For decades, American companies could look north and see one of the safest markets in the world. Today, that market is more cautious, more skeptical, and more willing to buy somewhere else. The damage can be measured in lost bottles of wine, canceled hotel rooms, and declining orders. But the deeper loss is harder to calculate. It is the loss of automatic trust. And once trust becomes a choice instead of a habit, it can never be taken for granted again.